which are happening in this area today. First of all, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Maria Stoicheva. She is the Jean Monnet Chair and Professor at the Department of European Studies at Sofia University at St. Clement Odrisky, Bulgaria, and her research interests lie in the area of European Union policies, European identity, European integration, and European language policy. If I may start with introducing the topic, the European Union, the identity issue, and why does it matter? The EU as a polity has been argued by many authors as the most successful polity, the most successful example of regional integration worldwide after the Second World War. Some other authors contest that, saying that as soon as you say it is the most successful example of integration, of regionalism, you are Eurocentric or EU-centric in your perspective in the study of international relations. The EU, the GDP of the EU today, it is $17.2 trillion as per 2017 current USD figures. That is second only to the United States. That makes it the second largest single market in the world, the third being China. And moving from that, let's say, a neoliberal perspective to some identity issues within the European Union today, we have seen in the last many years, in the last 4 to 5 years, starting the European Parliament elections in 2014, more and more elected representatives of the peoples of Europe have been from Eurosceptic political parties. In Sweden, 1 in 5 representatives in the last government were from a Eurosceptic far-right party. In Austria, the coalition government consists of a far-right party. In Germany, in September last year, we had the words of Martin Schulz from a center-left party saying that in response to a center-right party, Alternative für Deutschland, which is now in the Bundestag, a far-right party, more than 80 seats in the Bundestag, his words were, "We have heard this language in this house before," when he was mentioning that these far-right parties, populist parties, or maybe far-left parties, they simplify complex phenomena of the 21st century and simplify them, use very simple terms to address these complex issues. Greece, the head of the Greek government at the European Parliament a few months ago said it will be a fight of basic principles, referring to the European Parliament elections which are going to take place 3 months from now. It will be a fight of basic principles and values to defeat extreme neoliberalism and far-right populism. So clearly, and obviously Syriza being on the left. So clearly we have voices across Europe. These are identity matters. And if I may take one more example from Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the head of the Hungarian government, he has been the head since 2010. He has also served as the president between 1998 and 2002, and in his discourses before the national elections last year, he invoked a national Christian identity very strongly in many of his interviews, in many of his speeches to the people. The instrumentality of blocking immigration in ensuring better economic performance was developed. Connections between political identity and policy choices, very importantly, that can preserve the Hungarian identity and society. This was also invoked. Side by side, an identity, a common identity of the Visegrad states, which is Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and side by side Croatia, Italy, and Austria. These are cleavages that we are seeing in the political phenomena in the European Union in the last few years. So before I start, before I request Dr. Stoicheva to take the floor and address us, one final quote from Winston Churchill in 1953. His quote to the House of Commons: "We have our own dream and our own task. We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not combined. We are interested and associated but not absorbed. If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, it must always choose the open sea. That's obviously in context of the Brexit, which is happening. May I ask Dr. Stoisheva to address us? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this introduction. So you see, this is the topic of my presentation. It is meant as an introduction to this very specific and highly debated issue in Europe, and particularly on the eve of the European elections, this becomes really a very important issue. So, if we start from the beginning, with the Treaty of Rome, probably that's something most of you have heard about and know as you are students with courses. So it was signed on the 25th of March 1957 at the Palazzo del Conservatori, which is a very important place in Rome. You can see here that it was really a very important event. Most of these are men wearing black, with one exception. It's interesting to see who is that. The signing of the treaty was in one of the main halls of Palazzo Conservatori, which is just in front, aligned with the square, the capitoline square that was designed by Michelangelo. And here on the wall you have triplet pictures of warriors fighting wars, which is a very important context. So the key objectives of this treaty, as you say, so this is the beginning of this enormous, unsurpassed, as they say, success in creating a common market, was the common market and the customs union, but also they included the issue of ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, which is somehow the beginning of what we are talking about now, and also pooling of enormous resources to strengthen the peace. You can see there were 6 countries signing the Treaty of Rome. As you said, I will add to that, Britain did not pay attention to that. They actually were not interested very much into this process. We can say that the Times gave only 1/3 of a column on the 8th page of the newspaper. They signed just a reporter who wasn't one of the top reporters of the newspaper. And as he reported when he went back, he passed by Palazzo dei Conservatori. There was a lot of speeches, absolutely no security, so he just entered and observed the signing of the treaties. 60 years later, when this was celebrated again in Rome, there was one substantial difference. Security was everywhere. So a lot of things have changed in Europe. There is a bit of prehistory of the signing of the treaty, and this is something I would like to start with. That was 9 months of working in absolute secret. And the name of this secret was a chateau near Brussels called Val Duchesse. There were small groups of high-ranking officials who were sent there. They were working on 3 floors. On the first floors were the lawyers. On the second floors, from time to time, came the politicians. And on the third floors were the typewriters and the translators who desperately were typing what the lawyers were doing on the first floor. Everybody who was there had a contract banning, sworn to silence of what they were actually doing there. So that was absolute secret. They were even banned to tell their own families what they were doing in Val Duchesse. So this big thing, that is the beginning of something very substantial, was developed largely in total secrecy. Okay, 9 months were okay, and then they were rushing to sign the treaty, rushing to Rome. Rome was chosen as an emblematic place where the treaty should be signed, and it has also a symbolic, very important reference to what now we are talking about European identity, trying to situate the new union on something that is acknowledged in a wider sense. They were rushing. There was a very tight deadline for signing the treaty. They were ready at the end of February, more or less the time now, and they had to sign it, as you see, on the 25th. That's not a lot of time for doing this, but they had to rush. Why? That's a period when they were expecting that someone in one of the countries in Europe who was not very much in favor of signing the treaty, of creating a common market, was going to come back to power. Who was that person? No idea, yes? What was happening in 1957? France was waging the war in Algeria. So who should come? Everybody in France was expecting again to elect Charles de Gaulle to power so that the war in Algeria had a successful outcome. De Gaulle was a big opponent of signing of the treaty. He didn't like this idea. What's even more, if I quote some of his press conferences before that, he had publicly committed himself to killing the European Communion stone dead. So that was a critical deadline. So everything was prepared. You can see everything was ready. All the people were dressed, but there was a little snag, a little problem that occurred just before signing the treaty. The Italian print house couldn't manage to print the treaty. They claimed they didn't have enough time. So what they could do is actually print 6 sheets of paper of the first page and the last page. So what happened at this majestic signing was that the 6 signatories signed a blank document. There was nothing inside. So if you look here, you will see that there are not many pages there in front of them. Okay? After that, the Italians explained that it was not the Italian publishing house that was actually to blame, because the Swiss delayed the train on which all the copies of the translations were put. But then when they arrived in Rome, a cleaner in the house where they were working on the translation mistook all these papers for rubbish and threw them away. So there was a long story of why this happened. Okay? So why I'm saying all this, that's the interesting thing. Because 3 years before that, and that's something I would like to make my introduction to the topic, is a very famous French philosopher and sociologist. Some of you might have heard this name, Raymond Aron. He said this in one of his famous books at that time: the European idea is empty, as if predicting this snag, this problem that will happen at the signing of the treaty in Rome. It has neither the transcendence of messianic ideology nor the immanence of concrete patriotism. It was created, he said, by intellectuals, and that fact accounts for its genuine appeal to the mind and its feeble appeal to the heart. Okay, so 3 years before signing, somehow he predicted or said something about that. So the big question that I put here is whether the European identity is an empty concept, that we can fill whatever comes to our mind. So if we follow this line of development historically, I would like to put some main markers, pillars of this development for you to understand how it's developed. is the document on European identity, 1973, which is actually the first time when the issue of the European identity, the term European identity, was put on the political agenda. Up to this moment, people were writing in academic circles. From time to time, someone might say something in a speech, but very rarely. But this issue was not debatable, and not to the extent that it is today now. So you can see this is the first sentence of this document, in which it is said that the 9 member countries, at that time they started 6, 1972 was the first enlargement, so 3 countries more became members of the European Union. Which are they? I mean, the famous United Kingdom that we nowadays is always in every talk we give, Denmark and Ireland. So that was already not the little Europe, as we used to call the 6 signatories, the 6 members of the European Economic Community in the beginning, but there were already 9. So that was one of their main and first political acts, and that is the first sentence. So you can see in the first sentence what they say. The 9 member countries of the European communities have decided that the time has come to draw up a document on the European identity. So what is this time that has come? So a bit more on this. 1973 is the time when the United States actually officially declared as a year of Europe, 1973. So in a speech on April 23rd, 1973, to an Associated Press luncheon, which is a very public event in the States, in Washington, Henry Kissinger proposed a new Atlantic Charter and did not hesitate to emphasize that America had global responsibilities, and here the issue of global is important, while the European Community's countries only had to deal with regional problems. Okay. Moreover, he insisted on a greater degree of military burden sharing. Why this sounds familiar nowadays in some of the speeches of the current President of the United States, as only Europe's economic contribution would guarantee the further functioning of American security umbrella. Okay? So why was this year proclaimed by Henry Kissinger as the year in Europe? Well, he has recently contributed his peace treaty with Vietnam, negotiated the famous SALT agreement with the Soviet Union, which is a very important step in what we call in those periods. And also he initiated relations with the People's Republic of China. The Nixon administration in that period claimed considerable success in its dealing with adversaries, with the others, yes, with the others. So Europe had finally reached the top of Kissinger's agenda because they realized probably that very much engaged in negotiating and achieving the success with adversaries, they have forgotten something about their allies, the allies in Europe. The European reaction to Kissinger's Year of Europe speech could hardly be characterized as enthusiastic and grateful response on behalf of the European countries to this interesting and original plan. He had a grand plan, really, to do these negotiations at a high level for 3 or 4 months, and then have a draft of a new Atlantic Charter, and then followed by a great summit attended by Nixon and all the European heads of states. So it was going to be a splendid example of symbolic diplomacy. but what happened out of that, I'm not going into details, is what we said just a minute ago. The document on European identity, which was not at all in line with what Kissinger had planned, and actually the action from outside, from the States, brought us to a new important aspect of developing of the issue of European identity. This is a completely different conceptual framework which requires recognition, and this act of signing the document on European identity was a very important act on requiring recognition of the new economic communities, of the new communities in Europe on the global stage. So actually, it became the year of Europe, but not in the originally planned sense. And here we would also like to specially point that that was a period when the significant other of what can be considered within the European context was very clear. That was the Iron Wall. Yeah, very clear. But actually we go into a dynamics of fragmentation of the others and the actions of other agents in this process that can trigger specific actions for recognition and for stating your identity in an international plan. Two more facts. If you have been through a course on security, you know about the EU security strategy of 2003. So that was the first ever strategy of the European Union, strategic document in the area of security. And here's the first sentence of this strategy. You can read it. Europe has never been so prosperous, so free, and so secure. This is already a self-reflection and an understanding, a self-realization, put it in words, in strategies, of what you consider yourself to be and how others should look at you. Okay, not much time came, after this strategy, when everything in the world changed, but more dramatically changes occurred in Europe itself. And the global strategy for the European Union foreign and security policy was developed so. And there was even not an issue, a memory, a reference to this first sentence of the previous strategy. So the first strategy was called the Secure Europe, and that was the image that was proclaimed through this strategy, while the second was talking about shared vision and common action, and that we need a stronger Europe. And if I want to add something about this image of Europe, that is a projection of its own understanding at this level, at political level, I should use this quote from the last strategy, from the strategy of 2016. The European Union will promote a rules-based global order with multilateralism as its key principle and the United Nations at its core. As a union of medium to small sized countries, this is important here to say, we have a shared European interest. And what is this interest? To face the world together. Okay? So that's a new image of the European Union in its own self-understanding as a global security provider, as a responsible global stakeholder, and as a global player on one condition: if it acts together. Okay? So now I can move to another area, because I said I'm going to try to introduce you now into this topic. And this is a specific aspect of the European identity, which is very much linked to to the understanding of national identity. And here I go straight to this what we call heroic aspect of national identity, and this heroic aspect has been pervasive as a reference point, a point of reference in the study of European Union identity at all levels. This is something that always comes to mind. And I just quote something here, again from the 90s, 1995, a criticism of the possibility of formation of really strong European identity of Anthony Smith, who said that without shared memories and meanings, without common symbols and myths, without shrines and ceremonies and monuments, except bitter reminders of recent holocausts and wars, who will feel European in the depth of their being? The issue of deep identity is very complex, and I don't want to go into that, although I will give an opposite understanding of that. Who will be willing to sacrifice themselves for so abstract an ideal? Something that appeals to the mind, but not to the heart. In short, who will die for Europe? This is a question that Benedict Anderson also asked later. So we can see that this is a very important line of understanding. To this, just a year after that, or 2 years after that, another important scholar in this area asked the questions: do nations have navels? That's a question about the tension of pre-modernism, who saw national identity as historically determined, and the view of the modernists who saw national identity as a creation in response to modern social requirements and conditions. Identity from this perspective was not a precondition for the emergence of political regimes in the case of national states, but was used to support the development and maintenance of such regimes. You understand? So it was not a precondition. So then Gellner concluded, and that's the author, what did he say? Some nations have navels, some achieve navels, some have navels thrust upon them. Those possessed of genuine ones are probably in the minority. But even if they are in minority, it matters little. So if there are philosophers in this room, they will go back to the understanding of unimportance of personal identity. It's a very important line in the philosophical understanding of personal identity. So even if the European Union were to create and locate a navel somewhere, and there was a long search of such a navel, a search of European identity, it will still continue, this concept, to be contingent, contextual, and I've shown some examples of it being really contextual, and dependent on continued appreciation of the valued goods provided by the European Union. Okay, so much, but it expressed the view that much of the detail of human nature is a social construction. Okay? So can we create, following, yes, the disembodiment of bodies, yes, this again a philosophical question, something like an European? So that's an open question. To that, I would like to oppose another idea. This is the idea of the banal versus the heroic Europeanism. It is argued that if we follow the process of European integration, European Union identity is underpinned by a process which is very banal, contingent, and contextual. So what is banal Europeanism? It's an implicit or subconscious identification with or attachment to the European Union, which is essential in some sense to the continued functioning of the Union. This means we let life continues and we do not contest what's going on, yes, in it. This is a manifestation of this subconscious identification, but also of the normalization, if we use this word, of the European Union as a legitimate political authority. Such a legitimate political authority that to challenge this norm is actually equal to challenge the status quo. So it was not anything new in how our life goes on, but it is banalized, it is normalized. We accept it as something which comes along, like our telephone, like new technology that we start using. So this is important. It does not mean that a conscious, appreciated Europeanism may also emerge as a result of this meaningful presence of the European Union in for its citizens. But this conscious appreciation that the fulfillment of various functions is associated with the European Union as a political authority, and it is most likely to emerge when we perceive the benefits of our being close, working within the context and the framework of the European Union, and more importantly, when some of the benefits that we have are under threat of being lost. You understand? So in many sense, we are banal. We have a banal European identity, and we feel this if they say, from tomorrow on, you have to have a visa to go to France. Then we'll be really angry. Why is this happening? Yeah, so when a particular benefit is under threat, this might become a specific issue. So this banalization of European identity, of identity as a whole, this is something that is developed and that can be said also for national identity. There's a lot of banalization in national identity as well, because this is how things develop. But in the European context, this facilitated the role of the European Union in allowing diverse identities on its territory, in its framework, to flourish. The identities that were before that non-existent or squashed somehow. And we see that with regional identities that started flourishing in some aspects, city identities, identities to cities, identities of cross-border regions also have occurred a lot, and we can continue with other identities on the territory of Europe. And also, it encourages the development of a sense of banal identity, European, as opposed to this heroic feeling that very much is developed by that. And again, to give a reference about that, this is a book that talks about nationalism, but there is an interesting quote in it when Billig said that membership of the EU increasingly becomes the norm terms. The EU becomes inhabited, and that's an important word, in that individuals forget to remember that the current situation is not how things always were. Okay? Another issue I would like to say is a very key distinction which we need to make when we talk about European identity, and here I put the distinction. That's the distinction between identification as, and I give an example, as a European, identification with, and then comes the European Union as a political entity, or generally a support for European integration. And what here we need to say is that the importance of this implicit as well as conscious identification is developed or deconstructed in different terms. So I'm not going to talk much about that. So let's see then why, and we can say that nowadays there is really a well-developed policy of European identity within the construct of the European Union. If you look at the programs that are supported by the European Union, there's hardly a program among the priorities of which there isn't a sentence saying that it should promote European identity. So why is this policy needed? Because it was felt that it is needed, not just enhances, but it justifies the legitimacy of the European Union. It became, this policy, more salient following the economic and migration crisis, so it's becoming more and more visible. And also in a situation which you mentioned and you started with, so I don't have to add much about that, concerning the anti-EU sentiment. And here is a recent map from probably a few months of this situation, so you can see what's going on in Europe. So this is the feeling, the debate and the discussions before the European elections, which is very much in line. Okay. So what about research on European identity? I can say that this is also something that has substantially grown since the beginning. We start with 1957, that's where I started, and it is one of the most growing, more increasingly growing fields of EU studies. So if we start from the 60s, probably these are some terms that you might be aware or not aware of. There's transactionalism, which was talking about the creation of sense of community through intensive communication, but it made a reference clearly to a security community that prevent any conflict to arise, famously presented by Karl Deutsch, or the neo-functionalist theory, which you probably also could have come across, but Ernst Haas, who was even thinking about a potential possible shift in loyalties in the 60s, in the beginning of the 60s, from the nation states to the European level of decision making. So that's, he was even talking about that, but eventually it does not happen. Then we go through the 70s, when there was a wider development in this area, with the political science stepping into the research on European identity, looking at typologies of support for the European Union, and the basic distinction was between the utilitarian support, which is based on the perceived and objective benefits that Europe brings to the citizens, and the effective support, which is a diffuse and emotional response to the European ideals. A lot of the social identity theory and self-categorization theory from social psychology again entered this area, making the European identity research one of the most multi and interdisciplinary area of research, which divided and talked about different dimensions of European identity. I say cognitive dimension, which is the extended dimension where the people categorize themselves as Europeans or not, about the affective dimension, the emotional significance of the we feeling, we the Europeans, and the evaluative dimension, which is related to the content of what that underpins the categorization of European, and also going to the idea and introducing into this field of research the multiplicity of territorial identities, something I have mentioned. So you can see on this graph here that, I mean, this growth of research, these are the number of papers in Scopus which have European identity in their title. So you can see what's happening, I mean, in this period, really growing. So that's a justification of what I say, that it is growing. And one example for these, the research in this area is the famous Eurobarometer. And I will use the famous question that provides us with information and longitudinal information about European identity, identification. So if we again try to make it so, the red line is, the question is, do you feel yourself as, and there are 5 possible answers. Probably you don't know about this question, so I should say it. The possible answers from which you choose in the Eurobarometer survey, but the standard one, which means this is a survey that is conducted twice a year. So we have backwards, we can go very long, I mean, to see how it's, so either the answers can be only national, national and European, European and national, European only, and don't know. So if you look at the way the answers are located, you can see what enormous gap there is between the first 2, which start with national, and the next 2 or 3, in which European comes first. So what else is important to see from this graph, and I want to draw your attention to, is the way European and national identity, the answers, are bound together. This is something like a DNA. Can you see it? It's something like a DNA. Something that cannot be divided. So that's the issue, that national and European identity are somehow really bound together, with the potential for national identity to be revived, opposite to what Ernst Haas was going to say, the shifting of loyalties, and with European identity to go down. But I mean, this is very important to understand, which means that we cannot talk at all about European identity without in the picture to always consider national identity. And it gives us an idea what European Union is, yes, deeply inside. Okay, so that was accepted as absolutely normal and a justifiable object for research, because now I'm in the field of research. And so this is how this was interpreted in research on European identity. National and European identities were considered as closely bound together. There was the issue that there's no competition between them, no shifting of loyalties whatsoever, because they are not part of a zero-sum game. To the first place, the theory of multiple identity was put, and that there was looking for how these multiple identities can coexist in harmony, and also considering the European identity as something multidimensional, and looking for expression of this multidimensional framework. And again, not to go too deep into that, here is some of the examples of how this combination, which I call the DNA of European and national, the way they are bound, was interpreted. So they were saying that it can be a cross-cutting identity. You can see on the side what this means visually, yes. Some identities might overlap, but not all members of an ethnic group may identify with their nation or with Europe. You see the 3 circles on top. They can be nested, and this is the famous model of the Russell doll, one into the other. Smaller collective identities, local, are part of larger ones. After that comes regional, national, and then European identities. They can be completely separate, and this is a normal situation, but also they might be intertwined in a way in which we cannot find a specific structure. It's the famous, they can be blended in a way that we cannot even identify the logic of their combination, and this is the famous model of the marble cake. Okay, so here I would like to say just a few words what we are doing representing the university, what sort of research we are doing, and where we situate ourselves, just very briefly, to know that. So what we have been doing in the last almost 7 years is trying to contribute to what we called measuring of European identity. As you can see, the Eurobarometer is a useful tool, but it does not tell us anything about the content of the concept of European identity. It asks us to tick whether we feel European, but my feeling is European, the content, what I include in my understanding of European, can be completely different from another European, yes? And we have similar, for example, in one of which we studied very carefully, Eurobarometer survey, there was the same numbers of people feeling European in the UK and in Turkey. So do they actually refer to the same understanding of European? So what is it? So does this give us any idea if you remember, I was talking about the cognitive, affective, and evaluative dimension. So it does not tell us anything about the content, what we include in the content. So for this, we use a methodology which is, not a new one, but I think it has new application in political science, in other, which is the so-called Q methodology. Have you heard about that? Huh? Q methodology? No, so I say something about that. This is an example of how Q methodology looks like. For those who don't know anything about it, I'm not going to explain, but I would like to say that this is about subjective understanding. This is a methodology that combines qualitative and quantitative aspects, methods, and it looks at the subjectivity of issues. It goes deep into the subjective understanding of discourses related to European identity in our case, but it can be applied to various topics. It is called Q methodologies, and as an opposition to the so-called R methodology, for those who have methodology classes, that might be interesting. This is a research method to use and study systematically human subjectivity or people's viewpoints on specific topics. It has a very specific way of collecting data and sorting data. It is based on statements, not on ticking boxes, and it asks the respondent to arrange rather than to evaluate them, thus expressing their thoughts on some ideas not in isolation but in relation to other ideas. The result of this is that we can actually take from this methodology and we can look at the content that underpins categorization. In our case, this is European identity. And I just give you an example of of discourses that we can take out with this methodology of understanding people's identity. And we label these discourses because they consist of a long list of statements in which all the members of the participants in this discourse can share. And we have research in this area conducted in several aspects. We have research conducted in several European countries with young people at this age at universities, because we are interested in young people more, than general, although we made some also references to old people, to older people, to their parents. We have done this, we've used this methodology at looking at the European multilingual city, understanding what are the people's attitudes and how they understand their identity and their identification with the city, which is a very important thing. We've done that in London, in Dublin. So it's very interesting stories and discourses that emerge from that. And I can tell you the discourses that emerge in these areas, in various countries, are very different. This means we can go deeper into this understanding of what people put, how they understand their identity. Okay. So this many-sidedness of things and these conditioned viewpoints on the European identity, of course, have their background in the national situation, in the nation states, but there's a lot also, to consider related to the European Union in this sense. I think that's one of the greatest weaknesses of the EU could be in the institutions and their architecture. Look at this. So who's going as a normal citizen? Who's capable of making sense of this process of decision making? It's so complicated, yeah? Sometimes it's even complicated for people working there, but that's enormously complicated, yeah? This technology of decision making at European level really is some sort of enigma. People don't understand this, actually. So this is a great weakness of the European Union, and we know that it is inevitable, because 28 countries have to negotiate something with all their legitimate institutions, political institutions. It's really a very complex process. But when we talk about the identification of the citizen with the European Union as a polity, it just is so complicated and vague and impossibility. And I would just relate it to something else. You know this parable about the blind man and the elephant. It's universally known. So several blind men, approached an elephant, and being very curious and eager for knowledge, each of them touched the animal in an effort to discover what the beast looked like. The beast in our case is the European Union and this decision-making process. Each blind man, however, you know this story, but I would like to say it again, yes, touched a different part, yes. So for the one who touched the trunk, he said this is like a snake. The other who touched the ear said this is like a fan or a curtain. The one who touched the elephant at the side said this is a wall. Another one who touched the trunk said this is like a tree, like a pillar. It was a rope for the one who touched the tail, or a spear for the other one. Okay, so each of them, what is the morale of this story for me and for my presentation? No man arrived at the accurate description of the elephant. This is a similar story. Very, no, even researcher can sometimes come to an accurate description of the European Union. But the important thing is that each man had gained enough evidence from his own experience touching the beast to disbelieve his fellows and to maintain a very lively debate about the nature of the European Union. So in this situation, it is very difficult actually to lead a reasonable, a rational debate. So it was that metaphor, this story was used by, in 1972 by a European Union scholar, and it's still valid today. So if you allow me to finish with the idea of the manifold nature of things, and to put, I mean, if I put it as a question in the beginning, to say in the answer, as the question, what should be our relation with Europe, very often folds into, and generally folds into the question, what sort of people do we think we are? And answering the question about Europe, in Europe I'm talking, answers the question about us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stosheva, for that very academically rigorous and embedded in, let's say, the theoretical framework of social constructivism, if I may. I think especially the bachelor student here would find it very useful, as well as the master's and the PhD students who are here. And the professors. Of course, without saying. In perhaps going more deeper into issues and be able to navigate through these issues more effectively. I will now, the floor is open for questions, and questions for maybe the next 20 minutes, which can be followed by this case.
Well, you mentioned that the structure of the European government is very complicated. It's true, but at the same time, isn't the structure of actually every democratic government, like the institutions you showed, they are present in, as far as I know, in many democratic countries. So how is it different from a national government, typical national government?
Shall I answer, or we'll get to
Maybe
several
we'll have
questions?
3 questions,
Okay.
and then, yes, please, Professor.
So, quick question. Thank you for your presentation, which I really enjoyed. Referring to the social constructive understanding of the European society and European society of states, if you could reflect upon the key debates that has gone into the question of European cosmopolitanism, and if it has failed, and where has it diverged from the project, and where has it converged into the project. If you could just reflect that, I think the students would really find it useful. Thank you.
My question relates just on how this European identity research goes then into the question of no demos or demos with regard to political organization and legitimacy.
Okay. So how is it more complicated? It's not just more complicated, because it has to involve more access, yes, into it. But also because it somehow reversed some of the issues that are considered normal. For example, for a very long period of time, the national parliaments didn't have a say in the process of decision-making process at the European level. Why? Because if you look at the structure at the European level, all of a sudden, miraculously, the executive bodies, the governments, become the main legislative body of the European Union, which is reversing the whole process. Because the Council of the European Union
populations actually embodies the governments. And they have been, for a quite long period of time, the main legislative body. The parliament is taking a bit, more authority, responsibilities in this, but again, it is the council, that in some sense leads in this process. So this is reversing. So it's very complicated. So at national level, we elect national parliaments, but these parliaments here for a very long period of time didn't have any participation. Because the government or our minister can come and explain something to the parliament, but there was no way
To include the parliament, the national parliament, into the decision-making process. So this is reversing of the whole thing, yes? Which is very problematic. Secondly, this is the election of the European Parliament. Okay, so this and the way it functions. So it functions on a party basis, and there are party groups there, but it is elected on a national basis. So what is this? Yes. How is this constructed? Why is this the case? Yeah. And also, talking about legitimacy, it's the people voting for European elections is so low that this is a big issue about the legitimacy of this parliament, and this gives more power, more substantial power, and more a stronger voice to the council. Yeah. So you can debate things in the parliament. At least they can stop some things now if they're absolutely sure. But at the end of the day, it's problematic. Yeah? Who's going to be in the commission? The main body that develops all drafts, all legislation, all the things that sometimes the European Union is very much criticized upon. So for a long period of time, the parliament was not able, at all to interfere with that. So it's again something which is strange. So this idea that we need to have a parliament as a nominal value, as a face value for the democracy at this level, was not very much substantially justified. And the issue of the Court of the European Union is also great. And while in the debates about when they were debating before the referendum in the United Kingdom, Brexit, lots of colleagues that are Remainers, people who understand, and were teaching European studies and European law, were actually producing very important arguments against the role of the Court of the European Union. Why? Because they are somehow unaccountable to anyone, but not just unaccountable, yes, to anyone, but one of the main legislator, yes. So, and you study probably this spillover effect of the decisions of the Court of the European Union, and there's no one to stop them. And these are just 2,000 people. People there. Yes, so they're like gods. Yes. So what is it? So all this is so complicated, and sometimes you don't know whether, and those blind men who touch the elephant at the side, it becomes a wall that you really push into, and I don't know what you can do. So I would say it's immensely complicated, not just because there are more actors involved into that, but just because it reverses some of the basic functions as we understand them in a normal democracy. I don't know whether you agree with that, so I can continue with that a lot.
If I may add, this quote is long attributed to Henry Kissinger, where he said, "Who do I call if I want to call Europe?"
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's about Henry Kissinger, yeah, because he's become a hero now in my presentation. Yes, I mean, he just wanted to say that if he wants to, because he was reacting to this, that some of the things that he does are not consulted with the European Union, and he said that there's no foreign policy, yes, and he doesn't know who to call to say that he plans something. Okay. Okay, about the issue, you might see that actually it doesn't matter how much we debate the issue of cosmopolitan and European identity, you can see that in the discourses that we draw out of the content, what people understand. European identity is a type of cosmopolitan identity, definitely. And in this situation, the emphasis on values,
Sure.
the emphasis on values, which is, I didn't talk at all about values, I mean, now.
Please do.
It's exactly. Because very often, I mean, it's in the preamble of lots of the treaties, I mean, it's about the values that that to a great extent some policies are developed, particularly policies in the neighborhood countries and over the normative power of the European Union as a normative actor and all these things. So it's based on values. But what I should say is the moment we start talking about values, we somehow go out of the European Union and we go to universal values. We can't say that these are European values. You understand? So the more we emphasize the role of values in European identity, the more we just describe or look at the European identity as a cosmopolitan identity. So that's something.
There was an attempt also to define Asian values, and it was quite strong. At some point, ASEAN was very much talking about Asian values. Again, the same nonsense. There are no Asian values as there are no European values. And how are they different?
Yeah.
They are not different.
How are they different?
They are the
Yes,
same
exactly.
thing. Everybody wants peace and security and respect and dignity. So there is no such a thing
I
as...
guess there's much to be proved in the Asian case,
Yes,
whereas
yes.
the Europeanness and the European institutions have addressed the issue of cosmopolitanism, and this also ECHR has clearly defined that as, at least legally now. Whether it's not applied, of course, in the full extent, and clearly there are other
And I mean,
competitors.
also basing European identity on values for me has always been problematic. To some extent, and that's personal view. Why? Because we again select something from our history in the way nations were selecting historical facts, and we say tolerance. Yeah, but I mean, in Europe there's so much fanaticism, and it used to be. I mean, that was all the wars and religious, things. We talk about, I mean, liberalism. Okay, but I mean. Could be an invention of Europe, but I come from a country from a very undemocratic popular regime. So communism was also invented in Europe. So how are we selecting, this? So how exactly can we select and say that European identity, do we have the right to give this content to European when there are so many authors who talk about Europe and the history of Europe as, I mean, I can quote here, as time preparing for wars, waging wars, and recovering from wars, yes. So that has been for quite a long time the situation in Europe, and we have now only 65 years of really unsurpassed achievement of peace. But we also might be able to banalize this, I mean, as the way I was explaining, because, and start thinking and considering that this is something which is given, which is clear.
Thank you.
There was a question also of
Yes. About legitimacy. So I partially said something about the election in the parliament, yes. And I mean, that's Habermas was very much talking about that. I mean, I don't know whether you teach it,
Yes.
Habermas here, yes. So, and student might know that he thought that there might be a patriotism, which means affection, identification, based on civic
Civic
values,
values. Yeah.
yes. Not on culture, because cultures in Europe are really diverse, and that's a basic principle, preservation of cultural diversity. And that was this big sort of effort to initiate a new political entity with the constitution, but you see, I mean, the nation states are a very powerful construction.
Well, just to add a remark, you talked about cosmopolitan and European values and cosmopolitan values. I just remembered history. If you look at history, the last Roman and the first European was considered a philosopher Boethius, who suggested a concept of cosmopolitanism as a community of all thinking people.
Yeah.
All thinking people share the same community, so his ideas may be some kind of foundation for
Yeah.
also cosmopolitan identity.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Students.
Morhov, and you have a question, Sandra? Okay.
So there are a lot of things related to immigration that's been going on here, and a lot of this has to do with Europe's identity crisis. How, in your opinion, can this identity crisis be solved?
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
More questions, Suraj, please?
Generally we address European Union in terms of civilian power or normative power. Recently, Angela Merkel said about European Union forming a defense union, making a kind of a defense, because we were always relying on NATO. So how does a defense entity, if European Union makes a defense entity, how does that change European Union's, the soft aspect of the European Union?
Okay. More questions? Okay.
Okay. Okay, so the two questions about defense, yes, and about immigration. Well, there are cycles. I mean, what I showed you, this is the cycles of crisis, yes. So when economic, financial, migration crisis, whatever happens, it always has some dimension of the identity crisis. So when we look at ourselves, when we try to understand what we are, I mean, famous philosophers and literature in Europe has been dealing with that sometimes you discover yourself, you think that you could be acting in a particular way, but you act in a different way. So that's very human thing. And societies are something similar. So this means when there is a crisis of some sort, it doesn't matter what, it always has an identity crisis. And in this situation, you have to act in some sense. There is the need of a human action to overcome that. You understand? So there's no other way, I mean, I think, that you can resolve a particular crisis apart from your own action on debating on how you should act and also producing some action. What we see in Europe is different types of actions, yes? And what I say is that in this sense, it's not that, and these actions might be very controversial in some sense, and there can be a diverse range of actions. And what I was saying in my presentation is that we should understand the European identity as very much a contextual identity. It's something that happens on the moment, that provokes specific action, that requires appeal to the mind to see what is the reasonable action. But you can act also on an affective basis, yeah? So sometimes this is really mixed. So in Europe we see all these different actions. Some started building in the identity of the organization, the union as a whole. And how can we resolve it? Again, by acting. That's it. No other way. Sometimes action might lead to catastrophic results, and we've seen that. But I mean, this is it. And in this action, when it is a collective action, we need leadership and clear reference. Clear reference. What are the motives for these actions? So that's how, in communication, in debate, in understanding this, is the way to resolve it. And about defense, this is, the first big unification effort, integration effort. I started with the 1957 with the Treaties of Rome, but before that it failed, the defense union. It failed, yes. And it failed for many reasons, yes, but I mean, the availability of NATO and the role of the United States, all these things. I touched upon this a bit with the 1973, yeah, okay. So it has been really now reconsidered, because if the union has to become a stronger union, which is in the last strategy, a global actor, then we call it the D word, defense, is in the air. Yeah. And it's slowly moving, but everything within the European Union starts with small steps, yes? But this is the word that this is in the air, most of everything else. So we can follow what's going on and how this will be accomplished. But I think this is the big task now, as we call it, the D word, yes.
Okay, I have a question, perhaps if nobody else, this could be perhaps the last question, and we have had questions on identity, on defense, on demos, on cosmopolitanism. Perhaps I'll try to touch on the economics and the external aspect of the European Union. We know that there is a Eurasian Economic Union now, Mercosur and Pacific Alliance in South America, or rather Latin America, are coming together, which is perhaps another geo-economic pole in the world. And India and Pakistan both are now a part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There is an RCEP. And in this external environment, in the coming years, do you think this global neoliberal other could act as a restraint on these various sub-regional and national identities, keeping in mind that being a member of the EU, being a part of the single market, the bargaining power, each state gains bargaining power. So do you think this could act as a restraint given the external environment?
It could, it could. But there is definitely, and that's the reason I quoted from the global strategy, this quote where it clearly says that it's multilateral, what is supposed, and even in this strategy we do not have the effective multilateralism. Yes, so this means clear multilateral. So that's an understanding of the world, and I think the European Union will be very eager to somehow promote this experience and success of the regional cooperation is resolving issues in any aspect, even in the economic aspects in various parts of the world. So that's a model that I think will be an important part in any attempt or in any way in developing this, even in the economic area. So that's my expectation, although I'm not an economist, but I think this will be a line that will be really sustained.
Okay. Right. I would like to now thank Dr. Stoycheva for taking out her valuable time, and we do have for all our guests, if I may, present